Happy Friday. My name is Greg Smith. I'm Executive Director of the Florida Literacy Coalition, and I'm joined by my colleague Stephanie Rogers, our Education and Training Coordinator. Pleased to welcome you to this Friday webinar, which I think you're all going to be in for a treat as we're talking about writing. And we always like to do a session on writing around this time of year. We do have our Adult Learner Essay Book. That's our annual publication, and we'll put something in the chat about that. But we'd love to have your submissions. We've been doing this for 20 years now at FLC. We have a hard copy publication that all the contributing authors and their teachers get. We roll it out at the Florida Literacy Conference, and it's really pretty cool project and a popular project. So we'd love to have those submissions, and we always like to do a little bit of a special focus on writing at this time of year in conjunction with our call for essays. This year, I'm going to be talking about writing as it specifically pertains to the GED, but also in a more general basis as well. I do want to thank the Florida Department of Education for supporting this session and most of the professional development that we do here at the Florida Literacy Coalition. We will be making the PowerPoint for this session available in the chat a little bit later in the session. So you don't need to take detailed notes. You'll have that. We also have a session evaluation that we'll be sharing toward the end as well. And do appreciate your feedback on the session. That's always very helpful to us. And we'll be posting a few other items too in the chat as we go along. So with that, I wanted to introduce our presenter for today, Kara Krawiec, who is the Director of Student Success at Seeds of Literacy in Cleveland, Ohio. I know a little bit about Seeds of Literacy. I've followed some of their work over the years. They have a really robust program there, and I know Kara has been with them since 2017, if I understand, in various roles, and has also presented at various state and national conferences. We learned about Kara's work through the Pro Literacy series of webinars that they have. What's the name of their Teacher Training Plus, I believe. Is that what it's called? Yeah, Teacher Training Plus with Pro Literacy. So she brings a wealth of experience in adult education. So we're really pleased to have you, Kara, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Greg. It's Stephanie, and really thank you, the Florida Literacy Coalition, for having me. This is a wonderful opportunity to get together, and I know, as Greg mentioned, you have your deadline coming up for the adult essay book, February 5th, right?
Yeah.
Is the deadline. So it's a great time to talk about writing. It's a wonderful time of year to talk about writing. But I would argue that every day is a great time to talk about writing. So today, what I want to make sure is that we are able to have an open dialogue. I love to make my presentations as engaging as possible. I want to hear your feedback. I want to hear your thoughts. This is a space where we can share information and share knowledge with one another. So please, if you don't mind introducing yourself in the chat, I'm going to ask you to participate in the chat. But also, if you have a question, please don't hesitate to ask. The raise hand feature is awesome. Or if you want to, put it in the chat first. Or just turn on your mic. We're in a setting where we can actually have these kinds of conversations, and I want to make sure that we all feel part of the conversation. So welcome. All right, so I'm going to get started here today. And I like to point out that, as Greg mentioned, I present as part of the Pro Literacy Teacher Training Plus series. And one of the things I really love to do is make sure that I title my presentations based off of real student questions. So one of the most common questions I get when talking about the extended response for the GED test is, do I really have to write an essay? So what I want to know from all of you is what are some of the most common questions that you all get from students about writing for the GED? So yeah, if you don't mind, go ahead, put that in the chat, or if you want to unmute, like I said, this is an environment where either is fine with me. So yeah, and thank you guys. It's nice to see you, Mary and Robin. And as I mentioned, Danielle's here, so it's great. Please go ahead and put that in the chat now. All right, no common questions about writing? Well, I'll share some of mine then. So some of the things that I hear from students, other than, do I really have to write the essay? Often the questions are, how long does it have to be? How do I get started? And then, of course, that really concerning question of how important is grammar? Or I don't feel comfortable with grammar, so how do I approach this? And those questions often then really drive students to sometimes avoid writing in general. I don't know how you guys feel, but often when I'm facing kind of a blank page, that's one of the most difficult things to see and to think about, okay, how do I actually start writing? So those are some of the things we want to address here today. But I'm also interested then too, if at any point you want to share, what are some of your concerns about teaching writing for the GED? So I see in the chat, someone may teach more math than writing. So if any of you are more comfortable with some of the other subjects, I'm curious to see what brought you here today. And I want to make sure that I'm able to address some of the concerns that you may have while trying to approach this topic as well. All right. And as Greg mentioned, I just real quickly wanted to introduce myself. Hi, my name is Krawiec, and yes, I've been with Seeds of Literacy since about 2017. And one of the best things I love about being in adult education is the ability to build a strong learning community for our students. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about a lot today is how we can build a supportive environment for students to feel comfortable with their writing. So just a little bit of information about me. As they mentioned, the presentation will go out, so feel free to read at a later time, but I'm Kara. All right, so for today then, we're gonna start first by talking about how can we make writing relevant and accessible. So one of the most important things when we talk about the GED and how to approach it is how do we make it relevant? How do we make it accessible so that students don't feel that overwhelming pressure, right? Depending on how comfortable they are with their writing skills, it's something that a lot of students end up avoiding. And we want to make sure that they know they already are writing on an everyday basis, even just through simple text messages. But how do we make then writing relevant and accessible to all? Next then, I want to talk about how we can help demystify academic writing and grammar for students. So again, one of the things that I often hear from students is that idea of, okay, it has to be perfect. I'm worried about my grammar. I'm worried about how I say something. What about spelling? Spelling is huge. And we'll talk about that because the GED actually doesn't count spelling because they do not have a spell check. So that's one thing that's nice to tell students is, hey, guess what? They're not actually concerned about spelling. As long as the word is comprehensible, that is fine. But what we want to do is help demystify that idea of what academic writing is and grammar itself. And then, last but not least, I want to talk about how we can help students prepare for that GED essay specifically. Because again, as we know, a lot of our students, that is going to be the ultimate goal. And we want to make sure that they feel comfortable when they're facing that 45-minute extended response. All right, and I see Ashley, you said one question that you get is how long does the essay have to be? Yes, that is a very important question, and we will get there because I think another concern that students have is, will I run out of things to say? And are they looking for a specific word count? So we're going to address all those things today, but thank you for participating in the chat. I appreciate it. All right. So one of the best ways we can help our students feel more comfortable with writing is just to have a conversation. Often students feel, as I mentioned, so concerned about how do I start? How do I start this? That if you have a student who is really struggling with writing, ask them just to dictate it to you, and you can actually write it down. This is a great exercise that you can use if you have a class setting and you want to break students up into partners or into small groups. Just have one person be the note taker while the other one has that conversation and talks through their ideas. One of the best things we can do for students is just to remind them that writing is just speaking. It is your voice. We want it to sound like you. So if a student is really struggling with just getting that first word on the page, have a conversation instead. You be the one who writes this down. So if you're in a tutoring situation and it's a one-on-one interaction, you can do it that way. Or if it's in a larger classroom structure, break them into groups so that, again, it's focusing more on the ideas and not so much on everything needing to be perfectly placed. And it allows students to have that little bit of freedom to realize that, again, there is that connection between writing as a conversation. It is not just a one-way street. And also, again, everyone has a voice. And then what I would say is start slowly. So depending on the exercises that you use in your classroom, I would encourage students to start with just putting a couple of words on the page. If there are short response questions where they need to write a little bit more, tell them that it doesn't matter if it's a fully formed sentence yet. Focusing too much on the specifics of writing can sometimes be discouraging. So instead, just encourage students to get some words on the page, because as we all know, editing is one of the most important parts of the writing process, and the revision process can be so extensive. But in order to get there, in order to revise, we first have to have words on the page. So I would say start slowly. And again, don't worry about some of the larger order issues, but instead encourage students to just think about, okay, what are my thoughts? How would I answer this question? And put them down on the page. And here, as I mentioned, don't worry about grammar and mechanics yet. So this is something where that yet is very important, because you will get questions. I'm sure, as you all know, students are going to want to know, okay, how do I use a comma? I never use commas right. I don't know if anybody uses commas right, but that's something that we want to stress to students. Yes, grammar and mechanics are very important. Yes, we will get there. However, when you're doing exercises in class, it is more important to make sure that students are getting their ideas on the page and starting to feel comfortable with writing as a process. So again, stressing that we will get there, we will build, can be so helpful to kind of eliminate those concerns, those hesitations with writing in general. Especially if you have a very resistant writer. As I mentioned, it's also very helpful to talk about all the ways in which students are already writing in their everyday lives. Emails, text messages, making a list even. All of those things are ways that we're writing in very applicable ways, and why it's so important too when we think about communicating effectively. And then, as I mentioned, this word demystify. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but we want to make sure that students understand that academic writing is not some siloed, unattainable process, right? Academic writing is something that they can do and we can work towards. It's just a matter of building up that confidence first, building up the comfortability with it, and then applying it to more academic contexts like the GED. And I always love to stress this because encourage any and all writing, in any way that you can have a student even as an exit ticket, write down what you learned today. All of these are things that just encourage students to put things on the page. All right. And so here, one thing I wanted to point out was a great way to encourage students to feel comfortable with writing is to ask them to write about themselves. We always want to write about what we're most comfortable with, right? So telling stories is such a wonderful way to get students comfortable with writing. And that's why I love the project that you guys do with your adult essay book, because it's a wonderful way to encourage students to just reflect on themselves, on their learning process, on significant moments in their life. So actually, I know that you guys have on your website some list of questions to help kind of encourage students. I would say take a moment to share those in your classes. I don't know if it's built into your process already, but build in some moments where you can create that community around writing, and also encourage students to share that writing. So as you see here on the screen, a project that Seeds of Literacy did with our students is we actually worked with a local nonprofit organization that focuses on writing workshops and creative writing for all. And we held a series of workshops where students were able to talk about their history in the neighborhood and what it was like growing up and how they felt about their community and changes in their lives. And we published 2 books together with this organization. And then, as you can see here, unfortunately, one of the book releases happened during the pandemic. So we wanted still to honor that it's so important for students to hear their writing and hear their voices out loud. So we still had the release party, and these students all were able to come on site and obviously sit distanced, but share their writing and read it. And I love featuring the woman in front here in yellow. She was one of our students who was very resistant to writing and was very nervous about the prospect of trying to come up with an essay. So instead, we talked a little bit more about putting things into poetry and starting with just short lines. And she ended up becoming just this amazing poet. And she'd come to class with like a start of a poem on the tip of her tongue, and she'd end up then walking away with this almost fully polished, because there's always, more to revise with writing, but these beautiful poems. And it became so important to her that she actually started her own collection of poetry, and we were able then to pass it out to other students. And so again, I really want to encourage you any way that you can help students feel comfortable with talking about themselves and reflecting on their journeys so that they feel their writing reflects who they are as a person and they have a voice. All right. And then, as I mentioned, a couple great other things to just kind of include. Little writings, things that don't have a lot of pressure to them. So the what did you learn today? Wonderful exit ticket, just to make sure that as students are leaving the classroom, they put just, again, pen to paper, a couple of things. And I had to put in here, so each year we do a welcome to the new year. So as we are approaching 2025 somehow, this is a great way to encourage students as they come back into your classroom to reflect, but also to combine those skills of this is what I'm here for, this is what I want to achieve, and then also writing it down. There is power in language, and allowing students to see that, I think, is so wonderful. And as I mentioned, poetry, I think, is a beautiful way to kind of softly introduce how wonderful and lyrical and just engaging writing can be. And so I would encourage anyone who's interested. I always love doing book clubs with my students, but if you are able to facilitate a book club for students, start with something like poetry. It's accessible. It can be immediately then used to show students, okay, how can we create our own poetry? If students are very hesitant, you can have each student pick out a poem from, or excuse me, pick out a line from the poem that you're reading together, and then actually like create their own new poem. Or there are wonderful exercises like Exquisite Corpse, where everybody writes just one line and then you piece it all together. So all of these ways, again, to kind of play with language. It's really helpful when we're able to make it so engaging. So especially if you're working with learners who are very hesitant and resistant, there are all of these ways that we can make it relevant and accessible in different ways in the classroom. All right, how are we doing? Does anybody have any questions? I want to just pause. Or any comments? Do you already do anything like this in your classroom? I would love to hear what others are doing. Because again, I think sharing ideas is a great way just to grow and be able to kind of create a community for adult educators as well. So if you'd like, please share that in the chat. But yeah, also stop me at any point if you have a question.
I had a question.
Yeah.
And you may be touching on this a little bit later, but there's a lot of focus these days and a lot of attention around generative AI, ChatGPT, and other tools. Do you
Yes.
feel yeah, I mean, this is, when it comes to writing, it certainly can write for you, and that's not probably what we want the students ultimately to do. But are there ways that you feel that those tools can be constructively used by students in their writing development process, and as it pertains to writing for the GED or otherwise?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Greg. That's a great question. And you're right. It's becoming so much more relevant as a question in the classroom, but also just, in life, how people are approaching writing. And so I would say absolutely there's ways to incorporate that. So for instance, when we kind of talk about the writing process a little bit, ChatGPT is an excellent example of how to kind of get someone started with an idea, but then emphasizing that step of editing and revision, being able to say, okay, so now we have an initial idea, but let's revise it. Let's make it our own. And I think that can take away some of the pressure of needing to produce something. But it also creates a really nice example of how to emphasize revision. And I think that's really crucial because the revision process can feel very intimidating, but it also gets lost. It gets lost often because we tend to run out of time or get so concerned about, okay, I need to just write something down. But emphasizing that you can start with some assistance. And starting with something like a ChatGPT is a great way to, okay, now we have words on the page. Now, how do we make it sound like you? How do we revise it? How do we think about what we would expand, what we would take away? Thinking more than just the grammar and mechanics, but also then the content and the ideas to really develop, as I mentioned, your voice as a writer.
Okay. So
Yeah.
it's a good way to get things started. I haven't experimented too much, but is it good at, and generally speaking, I know there's a number of tools out there, but have you experimented at all, or have any of your students experimented with writing something and then asking one of these tools to give you feedback on your writing?
Yeah, so as I'm working with our graduates, so my role now at Seeds is to help our students as they're transitioning to college or careers. And one of the ways that we've been using ChatGPT is to think about like scholarship essays. And of course, that can be a very arduous process. So starting with something like ChatGPT, or what I also offer to students is samples of other scholarship essays and other things that Seeds grads have written recently. That way they can get an idea of just kind of the format, what it looks like, and again, just that starting point. I think the most important part is to stress that this is just a starting point. It's not the final product. And that's also, though, how all writing is. Even when we get like a final product, there's always room for revision. It's funny, sometimes I look at things I wrote, 5 years ago, and I'm like, ooh, I should revise that. Even if it's not for a paper or anything, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Mary, thank you in the chat. I totally agree. Yeah, write something first and then see how it compares to what the AI generates. I think that definitely helps, again, kind of look at, all right, how can we get something on the page and how do we develop our own voice? Because again, AI can be a very helpful tool, but it's not you. And so making that distinction very clear is important to students. Yeah, so thank you. I appreciate that a lot. And I'd also be curious as, others start incorporating more AI into their classrooms, just how it works with writing, if it does help encourage students. Yeah.
I was going to mention a piece of software. I'm not sure if you have it included, but Grammarly is an extension that you can use and will kind of check the tone or, will help with those little things to catch maybe more of those grammar mistakes that they might be making more frequently and, as they're kind of going through the process. So I found that super helpful and even for myself, or you can put whole texts in there to get revised. So I was like, that's a great one too.
Yes, I love Grammarly. I think, and that was one of the like earlier ones that was developed as well. So definitely would recommend Grammarly, especially kind of as students start to become more aware of grammar and mechanics. And so once we move into this idea of academic writing, how then that becomes a little bit more of a focus in the process. So kind of once we get that comfortability with just words on a page, next comes in, okay, how do we think about ourselves as writers and what does that look like when we're talking about grammar and mechanics?
100%. Mary
Yeah.
mentioned here that she's used Grammarly, but she's found some mistakes, which worries her for the students, and
Oh.
love for you to divulge a little bit more in that. One thing I do know is that sometimes they have different styles, like let's say AP style or things like that, that you can sometimes change the formats in which it's used, so that way maybe different things like that. But I'm not sure if you've seen that as well.
Yeah, well, so I think that's a great example of how, well, AI and things in general, there's some imperfections. And it's really important, I think, to show that even something like AI that's designed to, be this superior model of whatever, makes mistakes. Because the other thing too, one thing that I think can be really helpful and interesting is if there are mistakes in like the lessons or like something that's published, students are reading a short story or a book or like I said, maybe a lesson and there's a typo, or if there's a mistake in the grammar there, that can be really helpful to point those things out. Number one, not only to emphasize, yes, imperfections everywhere, but also to see, okay, you were able to identify that. You found something that was incorrect. And let's talk about revising it then. How would you correct this? I think there's a lot of power in also showing mistakes and being mindful that that's part of the process. And it's always a continuous like learning and growing process. Yeah. Although
100%.
I'll have to watch out now. Thanks for that, Mary.
Yeah,
I'm
right?
curious. I know. Now I've got an eye on Grammarly a little bit more. But one thing to kind of consider. Yeah, so thank you. That's actually kind of a perfect segue into what I wanted to talk about next, which is transitioning to academic writing. So once we do get to a place where students are a little bit more comfortable with putting things on the page, and they reach a point where you really want to start focusing on developing those strong writing skills that will be needed for the GED test, then we want to start talking about what is academic writing. And again, demystifying what that truly means. So there is a book that I absolutely love. It is called They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter in Academic Writing. It provides templates for creating argumentation, creating writing that allows students to see, okay, this is how things could be structured. And again, kind of using that as a helping tool to see, okay, this is how I may start a sentence if I want to respond to someone else's writing. But one of the things that I love is Gerald Graff, who is one of the contributors. He has a fantastic quote where he says, "The best writing has one underlying feature. It is deeply engaged in some way with other people's views. Too often, however, academic writing is taught as a process of saying true or smart things in a vacuum." So, one of the things I have found is often with working with students, they assume academic writing is always true and smart, and you have to be presented in this perfect way in order to be an academic writer. However, that's not the case. Even as this conversation is pointing out, right? Mistakes happen. But also, the important thing to remember about writing is it is a conversation. So reading is how we are able to absorb information and how others talk to us, but then writing is our version of the conversation. It's us contributing to it and responding back. So I think it's important to remind students that writing is a conversation. And that is a way then that we can make sure students understand that academic writing doesn't exist in this lofty state, but instead in this very accessible place where we're able to help them feel more comfortable with what it means to be an academic writer. And interestingly enough, with the GED essay, it's inviting students into that conversation. It's inviting students to think about how would they enter a conversation in an academic context. So when you're talking to students about what it means to be an academic writer or what academic writing means, we want to focus on the conversation. We want to focus on how you are responding to others, how it is not something that exists in this space that we cannot reach. And instead, we're able to access it at any point. And again, I would definitely recommend They Say, I Say. I think it's an excellent feature just to help students understand what academic writing is. But then, as I mentioned, using those templates to start crafting their own essays.
I also think sometimes it's good to just, and this can be just a very quick conversation, but share with students that academic writers, professional writers, authors of books, even the most prominent authors among us, don't write books off the top of their head. And there's an editing process there where they need to get feedback through multiple revisions. I mean, I think there's an assumption made sometimes that, some good writers are good writers and they just write and, it comes out the other end and then the book pops out,
Yeah. And then magically something is
Yeah, right.
published.
Yeah. And that even the
I wish
best
that was the
writers,
case.
even the best writers need feedback. And, that's part of the writing process for professional writers. And I don't know if that's something a lot of students know.
Yes. Yeah, I think the idea of sharing your writing is so crucial. So again, kind of starting with asking students to share, maybe a story about something they experienced like growing up or something, that, because we want to be careful. We want students to always feel comfortable with what they're sharing. But if they're willing to share their writing, I think that's a great starting point because again, as you mentioned, writing kind of always has an audience, and even some of the strongest writers need somebody else to hear it in order to be able to provide that feedback or be able to actually truly see what's going on in the writing and give, helpful ways to improve. Because that's always part of this as well. There's always room for improvement. That's one thing I always try to stress to students is even when you reach a place where you're like, okay, I have a finished, polished product, I'm going to turn it in. If you look at that several months or weeks or years, over the amount of time down the road, there's always something you could change. Because as a writer, you're always growing and changing in your understanding. So yeah, thank you. All right. Oh, Philip. Yeah. Thank you so much. There's no final truth. Oh, I love that. I would love to see that video. If anybody can find that and share that, I think that's wonderful. Yeah, so the writer should lay out ideas that are currently there. Yes. Yeah, I love that. If you have that video, Philip, I'd love to see it. 'Cause yeah, no final product. Yeah, I also find that like very hopeful too. And talking about writing as like a very hopeful thing of there's always this room to grow and change. Because I think sometimes what scares people the most about writing is the permanency, right? So if we're able to tell students, yes, writing is permanent in some ways, but if we think about, again, writing as a process, there's always then the space to revise. Okay. So I want everybody to reflect on what is your own process as a writer? So thinking about, okay, if I were to ask you all to write a short essay about something, what would be your process? How do you start? So yeah, kind of thinking about what is your process? And if you want, you can put it in the chat. I can share with you all what my process is. I do not encourage students to have this process. So in college and in graduate school, I really struggled with putting words on a page and getting started. And so I would sit at my computer and I would wait as long as it would take until I could write something down. And then I wouldn't be able to move on from that paragraph until it was perfect. Or as I said, as perfect in my mind as I could imagine. So that process ended up taking hours and hours of painstaking agony. So what I have learned since then is to not do that. So one thing though that we could do is share with students how you approach things and what you've learned about yourself as a writer in looking at and reflecting on your own process. Because then, what are the pieces that you find most difficult? So I told you guys I always struggled with kind of starting, but then I also really struggled with revising in the moment. So I would revise right there on the spot until I had a perfectly constructed sentence. And that was agony. Yeah. Oh, I love that, Danielle. Yeah, writing on paper. Yes. I think that's very helpful, right? There's something about that connection between your hand and the pen and the page that can really make you feel more connected to the words, I think. But yeah, I love that as a process.
I was just at an event at the Adult Literacy League last week
Yeah.
with the author. It's called The Reading Between the Wines, and author Lauren Groff, who's a author here in Florida, two-time National Book Award nominee. She was talking about her process. She has this large pad of paper, and she just writes it out in longhand on this giant, like sticky pad type thing. Yeah, it's very tactile for her, and that just helps her kind of use it. I thought it was kind of amazing that somebody at that level is not using a computer for her
Yeah.
first draft. It's just sort of all in longhand and on a very big pad.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's very interesting too, because especially for learners who need more like of a hands-on approach, having them physically see and be able to move words around and taking it kind of off of a computer screen. Like I love the idea of having a big pad of paper and like even physically being able to like maybe move a paragraph, to one side or the other and making it much more of an engaging process that way. Because then you can really see like how the organization of words really matters. But yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, especially for a writer who does so much of that. Yeah. And Stephanie, mind maps. Yes. I think that can be so helpful if you think spatially or if you want to kind of see the whole process. Mind maps are wonderful. But making sure again that we kind of ask students to think about their own process. Because a lot of the things that we struggle with when we're writing, our students are struggling with too. So again, acknowledging that writing is something that has to be actively engaged in, and everyone has their own unique process, and we can refine that process once we're able to reflect on it. So as I had mentioned earlier too, what's really helpful is reminding students that there are various steps in this process. So that first one is, yes, okay, getting the words down on the page, and then thinking about, okay, once I have these, how can I move them around? How can I revise them? So if anybody's interested, on our Seeds of Literacy website, I wrote a series of blogs about the writing process. Be happy to share that. Just kind of emphasizing each step in that writing process and reminding students again that they can change theirs. They can grow and develop with it. All right, and Mary, yes, I do use examples of essays from the GED books. I can give some recommendations for ones that I use, but yeah, we'll definitely get there because I think it's really important too for students to see examples of others. And the other thing I wanted to stress is when you're asking students to think about their writing process, as an instructor, we want to stress too that we model everything that we're asking students to do. So as students are writing, I will often write with them because I want them to see how I would approach it. Yeah. How we doing? Any questions? I see Mary, your question, but yeah. So thank you guys. All right, so now we are going to talk about writing for the GED. So this is taken from the sample GED test that's available for free online. One thing I would definitely recommend, if you don't do so already, is encouraging students to get comfortable with this, to look at the sample test online before ever trying a practice test. Because this allows them to see exactly the format of the test, what they're going to be looking at, and really get to practice within that environment. So I would encourage, if you just search GED sample tests, it's available online for free. But one of the things I wanted to talk about with this extended response is the complexity of what students are asked to do. So what I want to emphasize is here, it talks about 3 steps. So read, plan, write. So here it says, on the page 2 tab above, you will read 2 texts presenting different views on the same topic. Both writers argue that their position on the issue is correct. Then they want you to plan. So analyze the 2 texts to determine which writer presents the stronger case. Develop your own argument in which you explain how one position is better supported than the other. And you have to include relevant and specific evidence from both sources to support your argument. And finally, write. So, although it's not technically write, it's type. So you have to type your response in the box to the right. Your response should be approximately 4 to 7 paragraphs of 3 to 7 sentences each. So, that is a hefty task. That is asking students to do a lot within 45 minutes. So you have 45 minutes for reading, planning, writing, and editing. I don't know about you guys, but my writing process never takes just 45 minutes. If I am doing a full essay, that could take even a couple of days, depending on what I'm looking at. But 45 minutes is a lot. Or is not a lot of time. It's a lot to ask students to do within such a limited time. And also, I believe there was a question earlier, but GED does recommend that it's about 300 to 500 words at minimum. So the 4 to 7 paragraphs, 3 to 7 sentences each, but then about 300 to 500 words total. Okay, this is a lot. This is a lot for students to do. So one of the first things, though, that we want to emphasize to students is that what they are being asked to do is to analyze an argument. They are not simply being asked to give their opinion. They're being asked to determine which one is best supported. So technically, what the extended response wants from students is a rhetorical analysis of these two positions. So that involves a lot of critical thinking and analysis before you even begin writing. So it's crucial to talk to students about how do we determine which one is best supported? How do we know? Because as students often ask, is there a right response? Do you have to pick one or the other? Does that influence, your ability to get points on the essay? And the answer is no. You can argue either one, but you have to provide the support and you have to do the analysis for it. So one of the things I talk to students about is this idea of Aristotle's rhetorical triangle. When talking to students, I try to avoid using this kind of language. However, it is helpful to talk about it as a rhetorical analysis. And so what we can talk to students about, though, is when you're looking at this, there are 3 different ways that an author can appeal to an audience when they are trying to argue something. So they can use ethos, logos, or pathos. So ethos is the way that the speaker creates their own credibility. How do we know that we can trust this author? And this can be kind of difficult on the GED essay because often the authors aren't always immediately apparent, or it might just be like the board of something or a review of something. So ethos can be a little difficult. However, we do want students to think about, can I trust this author? And how do they build their argument so that I trust them? Because then the other way they can build that trust is through logos, which is logic. So being able to put together then what facts, what statistics are used to support their argument? What makes me believe it? And then the very last component is pathos. So pathos then is emotion, it's passion, it's how do we connect to our audience? So what we want to make sure then is which author is making the strongest use of hopefully all 3 of these components, but if not all 3, at least 1 or 2 of them, so that they are building a strong argument that makes you think, okay, this one is better supported. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, again, it's not whether or not they agree with the topic, but how is it approached? And can we trust then what is being said? And does it convince me to believe it? So actually, I often tell students, sometimes it can be helpful to not have much background knowledge about the topic that they have to respond to, because it means then you're going without a biased opinion, without your already preconceived notions about the topic. So you can truly just look at how is this presented? Because often students might be a little concerned or uncomfortable about, okay, I don't know anything about this topic. But that can actually be a benefit because, again, what it's asking you to do is to analyze. And it's really crucial to stress this step to students because in order to give their response, they have to do this piece first. Because that is one of the most important aspects of the GED essay is actually responding to the prompt. And responding to the prompt means, I believe this one is best supported because. So, how are we doing? Has anybody used Aristotle's rhetorical triangle in their classes or comfortable, familiar with it? How do we feel about this? If you want to put it in the chat. And one thing also I like to share with my students, this is something that I would actually do with my students in the freshman composition course I taught at some of the local colleges in the Cleveland area. So this is actually a college and career readiness level exercise. So when we talk about depth of knowledge levels, This is a level 4. This is that application. This is that above and beyond. And again, depending on your comfortability of how you want to present this to students, being mindful of some of the terminology. They don't have to know the difference between, the word ethos and logos and pathos, but remembering it's, do I trust this speaker? And how do they support it? And how does it make me feel? Those kinds of questions they can ask themselves while reading. All right. So this is a pretty intimidating task. Asking students to do all of this within 45 minutes can be a lot. So one of the things I use with my students is a template guide. So these templates then can allow students to feel more comfortable moving through this process. So one thing I use with students is this handout that kind of walks them through each stage of the writing process. This handout will be available if you'd like to use it after the presentation. I would definitely recommend because it breaks down each step. So as we mentioned, it's asking students to do a lot more than just write a quick essay. The first part is that reading and pre-writing, and then actually writing out the essay, typing it up, getting their words on the page. And then of course we do want to incorporate some editing and some revision. Again, that is one of the most important parts of the writing process. So here, when we talk to students, one of the things I would recommend as they are getting comfortable with analyzing writing, we can use what's called the CRAP test. I did not come up with it. I wish I did. It's brilliant and wonderful. But you want to see, are your sources full of crap? But CRAP actually stands for credibility, relevance, authority, and purpose. So again, getting at those questions of who wrote this? What does it actually say? What is the argument? Why did they write it? Do you trust it? So talking about all of those elements of the rhetorical triangle, but in a way where students can make it a little bit more accessible. And then one piece I would encourage is some outlining or taking advantage of some of the features on the GED test, which can allow students to highlight. But an important thing to note is, unfortunately, you cannot copy and paste from the articles. So stressing that to students, you can't copy and paste from the articles. You can highlight certain lines, but you can't actually copy and paste it from it to put it into your text. You can only copy and paste within your own writing. So I would encourage students to do some outlining, allowing students the opportunity, they can use a whiteboard. So students are given a whiteboard for all sections of the GED test. So even though it feels like, okay, I'm taking the language arts section of the test, I probably don't need to be writing a lot of stuff down. Guess what? You probably should take a whiteboard. Because again, you want to make sure you're noting specific things, like what is going to be your response to the prompt? Why do you think one is better supported than the other? And coming up with those reasons. You want to have at least two reasons. And then, again, because unfortunately you're not able to copy and paste directly from those articles, write down maybe the beginning of a couple of notable quotes so that you know where to look to then put them into your own essay. And then, of course, we get to the writing. Yay! As I mentioned, I think using templates is a wonderful way to help students feel more comfortable and have an approach for this. So I have written just a very quick, small sample of what it could look like for students and providing them some of those template sentences. So for instance, in that introduction paragraph, in the 2 articles provided, the authors present the pros and cons of what? What is the main topic? And then in that second one, you can summarize very quickly of, in this article, the author states this, whereas in the other one, the author states what. So that way you clearly present, I know what each author is discussing, and then following it up with, based on the 2 positions presented, I think this one is best supported because reason number 1 and reason number 2. As I mentioned, you want to make sure you have those reasons really well laid out because they become the basis of those body paragraphs. So looking into then, hey, I have my reason number 1, I have my reason number 2. Guess what? They only ask for 4 to 7 paragraphs. Write 4 paragraphs. Don't write 7. Don't do that. You have 45 minutes. Write 4 paragraphs instead. That's all they're looking for. Because at the end of the day, it's more important to get a fully formed essay done rather than bits and pieces of one. So do what you can with those 45 minutes and start with 4. Start with 4 paragraphs. That's all they need. Nothing too fancy. And then, of course, what you want to do is try to leave yourself 5 minutes. 5 minutes if you can. Just to do that final check, that final revision, to make sure that you include certain things. Because with the GED essay, it is graded by an algorithm. What we want to stress to students is this is graded by AI. It is graded by that algorithm. So it is looking for very specific things that will allow us to make sure you can get some points. So making sure you include quotes, including quotes from the 2 articles and having quotation marks around those quotes are a wonderful way to show the GED algorithm that, hey, I know how to support my argument. I know that I have to pull from these 2 pieces in order to develop my own. And then, of course, it's looking for clear organization. So with a clear organization, if you include things like transition words, if you include things like clear indentations with your paragraphs to distinguish, okay, I have 4 solid paragraphs with a topic sentence and a transition word in it. Those kinds of things clue in that, okay, this person has a strong sense of organization. So there are ways then, like I said, to make sure that you can help students put their best foot forward with this. And again, since it's graded by an algorithm, they're not looking for, any kind of creative and over-the-top displays of writing, right? What they're looking for is a very clear and concise and direct rhetorical analysis. So we can help coach students through that by making use of things like those templates, talking more about how do we analyze what we're reading. All right, does anybody have any questions? Any questions about these templates? About this handout? As I mentioned, yeah, I will be happy to share it, make sure that everybody gets it. But yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts. Okay. So the last piece then is, of course, grammar. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, grammar is one of those things that we know we have to address with students. However, you want to make sure that you build that comfortability and confidence first before we start doing like that nitpicking of some of the grammar components. So I always encourage students to think about, okay, what are our larger order issues? We want to think about, okay, sentence fragments versus run-ons, making sure they know how do I construct a full, complete sentence. And then we can look at things like organization or some subject-verb agreement. There are pieces of that that provide us with larger order concerns that will be able to make sure we provide. And when you start with those larger order issues, it becomes apparent that those are some things that you can address in all aspects of writing. Anything from, just a simple, 2 or 3 sentence response to an activity, all the way up to, an extended essay. So starting with larger order issues. And then as students are looking at their own writing and getting more comfortable with that revision process, ask them to pick out 2 or 3 repeated issues that they see in their writing. Ask them to identify it, because again, giving them ownership of their writing is so crucial, and being able to see, okay, here are the areas I need to review really helps place them in that position of, okay, this is my voice, this is my writing, but also this is what I can practice with. And then, of course, reviewing materials that cover those 2 to 3 specific repeated issues. So with those issues then, you want to help make sure that there is a level of comfortability and mastery with it, so that once they have a solid understanding of those larger order issues, then you could start to say, okay, what else? Now do we want to focus on commas? Now should we focus on semicolons? Anything then that gives students the opportunity to really put into practice what they are working on. All right, how do you guys feel about grammar? Yeah. Last thing, I always try to de-emphasize terminology. The difference between semicolon and colon, so crucial, but they are called semicolon and colon. So I'd rather have a student be able to identify which is which and when you have to use it, rather than knowing the exact term for it. So focusing more on the application of the concepts than the terms themselves. So similar to, as I was saying, about the rhetorical analysis, you don't have to use the terms ethos, logos, pathos. You don't have to talk to students about it in that way, because terminology can feel very off-putting, but you want to make sure that there's a solid understanding of the concepts themselves. Yay! Mary, I love that you love grammar. I do not love grammar. I think it's so funny that, like, in the English language, grammar seems like the grammar rules seem to apply only about 70% of the time. And then the other 30% of the time, it's like just made up. I don't know. And as I mentioned earlier, I feel like commas are one of the hardest punctuation marks to kind of master, which is difficult. However, I think, again, acknowledging that for students is so important. So Mary, if you love grammar, talk to students about how much you love grammar. I talk to students so much about how difficult it was for me to learn a lot of these concepts, and making sure that we can make it fun. And often if there's any way to do a little bit more of a play with it, so not to refer too far back, but poetry. Oh my goodness, I love looking at poetry with students, specifically if you're going to start talking about grammar, because the ways in which poets are able to play with grammar, it shows then how, once you have an understanding of the rules of grammar, you can then change it, and there's so many different ways to use it. So talking about grammar, I think, is so crucial, but you want to make sure then that it's after students have that comfortability and that mastery of how do I analyze, how do I respond, how do I put together an essay, and then we can kind of dig into, all right, now let's talk about grammar. And again, focusing on how writing is a process. All right. All right, guys, my next slide. All right. So we only have a couple of minutes, but I wanted to, I was going to have us do an exercise, but instead what I can do is, Mary, I know you had a question about using GED materials and kind of which ones I use. So one of the ones I would recommend is the Steck-Von series of materials. The Complete is fantastic. But also, I would say, anytime you can have students practice with essays and getting an opportunity to read the exemplary responses. So online, GED does provide different handouts that you could use with students and how they can approach writing for the GED essay. It shows some exemplary responses, and I think that's really crucial to talk about. Okay, here's an example of one that would receive very high marks, and asking students to identify why it would receive multiple points would be really important. So I would say absolutely use the materials on hand. If you would like, I can kind of provide a list of materials, and Greg and Stephanie, hopefully you could share that, because I'd be happy to do so. But definitely showing students samples and responding, and also putting it into practice. One of the essays that I use the most, or the extended response prompts that I use the most, is opposing viewpoints on tattoos. And I think it is an excellent example of an instance where we all have opinions on tattoos, and instead it is about focusing on how do the two authors present their opposing viewpoints, and thinking about, okay, what are the pros and what are the cons? Like I said, I'd be happy to provide some after this today, but I would say turn it into an exercise. Look at some exemplary ones, but also then perhaps look at some that wouldn't receive as many points to kind of see how could we revise this as a group, and giving students the experience of that revision process with something that's already written. I feel like I haven't said the word revision enough today, so forgive me. I feel like it's a lot, but hopefully you guys are okay with that. So I will say then, I want to get to this point. Are there any questions? Are there any questions? I would love to help. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Mary. Oh, and thank you, Philip. Yeah, so anybody have any questions? I'm a teacher. I can sit in silence, guys.
I have a question. So
Yeah.
you work with a lot of students that are studying for their GED, and I'm assuming, like many students, math and the writing are kind of among the harder topics.
Yeah.
Is there anything on the writing side that you feel, if you kind of have to whittle things down to giving students, two or three words of advice in terms of what they can best do to get themselves prepared in terms of being successful in that writing component? What would you had an elevator speech for GED writing. What would it be?
I would say, first and foremost, do it. Don't avoid it. And make sure that you practice with analyzing reading as much as then writing. Because the other beautiful thing is, the more you read, the more you get comfortable with the way others are writing and the way they shape arguments. And so that comfortability with not only like analyzing what you're reading, but then seeing other examples of writing can be so crucial. So do it. That's the first one. Just practice with writing, and then make sure that you are preparing both the reading side of it as well as the writing, and seeing, I guess my third piece of advice then would be seeing the beauty in language. There's power in writing, and there's power in words, and the fact that we have this opportunity to have a voice and to share it with others. I think showing students how crucial that is amazing. So that's the starting point. I hope that was three pieces of advice.
That's good. That's good. Thank you.
But yeah, and I see, just in case anybody wanted, here's my works cited, but also my contact information, so it will be in the PowerPoint as well. Please feel free, reach out to me. I'd love to continue this conversation. As I mentioned, it's one of the beautiful things about being able to exist in the adult education space, is we can build this community for one another and share ideas. So please reach out. Would love to chat further.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much. And Stephanie, can you please, have you posted the evaluation yet? Let's see. The session evaluation? I'm not sure if I see that here. Please post that. We'd love to get your feedback on the session. Thank you very much, Carrie. You've given us a lot of good advice here and things to think about in terms of our approach to working with students to promote and help them become more comfortable writers. I know it's a lot of our students, especially with our ABE and literacy students, there's a lot of fear around writing, and they've had some perhaps negative experiences when it comes to writing for academic purposes or otherwise. And so, but our essay book, I think, is testament to the fact that people can be, our students in adult education can become, quite well-versed, talented writers to express themselves through the written word. It's always a highlight of our conference when we have some of our authors get up and read, or some of the contributing authors to the essay book get up and read their essays. We have probably about 7 or 8 of them during the course of the conference that do that. So it's a great experience. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah,
Are
thank
there any
you.
additional questions for Kara before we leave and wrap this up?
Yeah, thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate it, and thank you
Okay.
for having me. Yeah, it's wonderful to get to talk about writing. So anytime I can.
Absolutely. And I did put into the chat, there's 2 other things. We have a pilot project that we're going to be launching next year um, with EBLI, which is evidence-based literacy instruction around reading instruction for adults. So if you're interested in potentially learning about that and participating in that, there's a link there in the chat. And also our conference is coming up in the spring. And we're going to be over at the Shores Resort in Daytona Beach, May 13th through 15th. So we have our call for presenters out right now, and I put a link in there if you're interested in potentially coming and sharing your some of your expertise or knowledge or experience with other practitioners. We'd love to hear from you. And that application or that call for presenters form is on our website, and the link that I provided provides some additional details as well. So with that, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you for coming, everybody, and thank you for Cara. Really appreciate it. And all have a great weekend.
All right, thank you everybody so much.